Our first actors and writers today. Kelley Ogden, who has been a Stories on Stage reader many, many times. We're thrilled to have her back. Annabelle Gurwitch, this is her first time, but I was just tickled to interview her. She's her writing and reader writing. It's funny and wonderful. She makes funny out of dark like no one else. So, but first, let me tell you a little bit about Kelley, who will be reading her essay called "In a Muted Zoom Room, No One Can Hear You Scream." Too true. So Kelley is a familiar face to Stories on Stage and Sacramento area theater fans. She last performed us on a Zoom at the beginning of the pandemic, performing a chapter from Sands Hall, who is our other writer tonight, Reclaiming My Decade Lost in Scientology. And if I'm not mistaken, this is one of Kelley's first, if not her first, live performance since the pandemic. Am I right?
Yeah, it's terrifying.
She's frightened, so be kind. She's an accomplished performer, director, and producer, and also a co-founder of the acclaimed fringe theater company Colt Run Creations. And you can read more of Kelley's accomplishments on this evening's program, which is on your chair, or on our webpage, and in Jessica Lasky's interview with Kelley on the Stories on Stage blog. And Annabelle Gurwitch, the writer whose work you will shortly hear, she's our first featured author this evening. She's an actress, an activist, the author of 5 books, including the New York Times bestseller and Thurber Prize finalist, I See You Made an Effort, which we have copies for sale in the back. She's written for the New Yorker, New York Times, Los Angeles Times, Wall Street Journal, LA Magazine, and Hadassah, among other publications. And her acting credits include Seinfeld, Murphy Brown, Boston Legal, and Dexter. And once in a while, she returns to acting, playing a rabbi on Better Things on FX. And if you have not ever seen Better Things on FX, you should go home immediately after here and find it and watch it. Or a therapist or an FBI agent in Michael Bay's upcoming Ambulance. She also co-hosts the Tiny Victories podcast. You can read more about Annabelle on her website, the Stories on Stage website, and in my interview with her, which was delightful, on the Stories on Stage blog. Her latest collection of essays is You're Leaving When? Adventures in Downward Mobility. It's a 2021 New York Times favorite book about healthy living and a Good Morning America must read. Copies are for sale also at the back of the room, and Annabelle will be signing them at the break and after their performance. One of the essays from that is entitled In a Muted Zoom Room, No One Can Hear You Scream. It's from the new collection, and by the title, you can probably relate to that, right? Raise your hand if after 2 years of COVID you haven't spent time on Zoom than you ever thought possible. Yes. So, with that, I am happy to be out of the Zoom room and welcome Kelley Ogden live to read In a Muted Zoom Room, No One Can Hear You Scream. I think we're good. Yeah.
The night my will to live crumbled, it was only a week into lockdown. I was home alone, standing over the kitchen sink, eating tuna straight out of a can. I'd feared it might come to this. I was becoming Blanche. As a young person and avid reader, the ruinous downfalls of Emma Bovary and Anna Karenina, those lovelorn heroines of the Western literary canon, held a romanticized appeal. Equally fascinating, but utterly terrifying, was Blanche Dubois, a precursory example of cancel culture, as I understood it. Tennessee Williams put us on notice. What was the most grievous fate a woman could suffer? Unmarried, financially insecure, beauty fading, unable to cope with her reduced circumstances, and, horror of horrors, dependent on the kindness of strangers. A Streetcar Named Desire ends with Blanche unceremoniously carted off to the loony bin. I'd seen a version of William's story play out in my own family. As a young woman hoping to extend her marriageable years, my grandmother, Rebecca, shaved several years off her age. Becca fancied herself a beauty and earned a reputation in the family for putting on airs. After her older brother and benefactor passed, his children unceremoniously cut her off. And she attempted to add those years back to collect Social Security sooner. She lived out the remainder of her life in reduced circumstances in Atlanta. Chin lifted, body at a 3/4 angle, feet positioned just so, hand on hip. She'd pose for pictures as though a woman of great stature till the end. As an actress, I'd hoped to play Blanche by channeling Becca. I just didn't want to become her. In February 2020, I was keeping my inner Blanche at bay. On March 16, my city went into lockdown. In a matter of days, my tenant hightailed it home, gigs evaporated, my shared writing office was shuttered, my choir was furloughed, my child's elected to stay on campus 2,000 miles away, and even my daily hiking buddy and mother of 5 was unavailable, now running a little house on the quarantine. Untethered to a daily schedule, time seemed to be folding in on itself. I fell behind on writing deadlines. Completing a sentence was a Sisyphean task. Weeping into my tuna, I Googled mental health hotlines. In Streetcar, a nurse and doctor who Blanche mistakes for a gentleman call her, escort her elsewhere. Even a day room in an asylum seemed preferable to solitary confinement at home. I knew this was not an ideal solution during a pandemic. I was going full-on Blanche. I had one last bar of sea salt dark chocolate, which I promptly devoured. And then I had an idea. In a sugar-fueled manic panic, I fired off an impromptu email to approximately 180 writers to join me for 3 hours of writing alone together. To ensure my own commitment to showing up, I requested that folks not RSVP. Day 1. I changed out of my night pajamas and into my day pajamas and opened my Zoom session expecting to find dozens of writers stationed at their desks. 5 showed up. 4 with whom I was barely acquainted, and the 5th was a West Side comedy writer whom I hadn't seen in months because I live on the east side of town. As every Angelino knows, if you live on opposite sides of the La Cienega Divide, the avenue separating the two halves of the city, you might as well be residing in different states. I laid out informal rules of engagement for what I hoped would make for a productive writing session. After chatting for a few minutes, we'd mute ourselves, write for 90 minutes, break for a chat, and write again for 90 minutes. When I was able to tear myself away from the disastrous way my computer's camera angle made my neck look crazy, I stole glances at the others, delighting in seeing humans other than the cast of Succession. And for the first time since locking down, I was able to resist Googling "Where's Dr. Fauci" every 10 minutes. Reinvigorated by having lengthened my attention span, I dashed off invitations for the next day. And as an afterthought, to gen up attendee numbers, I posted links on my social media feeds. Day 2. 2 returning writers and 3 writers I'd never met. Tampa, Chicago, and another West Sider who'd seen my invitation on social media, materialized at the appointed time. Dispensing with the chat altogether, we muted ourselves and got quickly to work. Suddenly, I was treated to a close-up of Tampa's crotch. Oh no. Is he going to take off his clothes and masturbate? I held my breath. What was I thinking? Inviting strangers? But Tampa was merely rising to take a stance at his standing desk. But once situated, my screen showed an even more intimate image. During that first session, I'd been so transfixed by my own stressed out face that I hadn't noticed. Typing into our documents on our computers had the unintended effect of us peering directly at the camera lens. As the session stretched on, during those dull, aching hours of staring off into the middle distance, the writers' faces registered a kind of blankness that I've only ever seen in dementia patients. Sometimes a quizzical look would pass over someone's features. Only later did I realize that the notes on my office whiteboard were visible behind me. Dry vagina. Divorce. Cat lady. During the evening session, Westsider1 wrote in the chat, "It feels a little weird having the cameras on, but it's also comforting. I'm sure once I get to know everyone, I'll be even more comfortable." I didn't have the heart to tell her how much I was hoping not to get to know everyone. In fact, Westsider2 messaged me with a similar sentiment. She wrote that our time together provided a kind of safe bubble. Both she and her husband had been laid off, and it was a relief to be connected with people, but not anyone who might ask how she was coping. Day 3. Awkward. I washed and blow-dried my hair and wrapped a scarf around my neck. But not only was it impossible to look good on Zoom, I was the only writer to sign on. For a moment, I felt the elation of a grade school snow day reprieve and was tempted to sign off. But on the chance that someone might show up, I reprimanded myself. "Now, go to your Zoom and don't come out until you've accomplished something." Thankfully, Tampa, another Chicagoan, a newbie from Pasadena, and 2 Westsiders trickled in. Day 4. A strange new normal, signing on, waving hello, and getting to work, set in. I didn't bother with makeup. Tampa, Chicago, Topanga, and 2 newbies, Brooklynites, who'd heard about us from a friend who'd seen the link on social media. That night, I was the lone Zoomer. I sent a text to Ezra on a whim. "I'm alone. Might you join me in my Zoom?" Mercifully, Ezra signed on. I didn't mute this session. I wrote, accompanied by the gentle click-clacking sound of the cubes sliding into place, as soothing as ASMR. It was only because I'd taken a break and was rapturously gazing at my child, practically a stranger to me now, that I spotted her, the young woman who entered our Zoom and took off the majority of her clothing. Her camera was positioned just below her face, so we'll never know who was more shocked, us at witnessing this striptease together, or our poor Zoom bomber who had gone to the trouble of plotting a disruption only to find an audience of 2, and a mother and her child at that. Day 5. Prior to signing on, I made the mistake of checking my IRA. A huge medical bill landed in my mailbox, and I realized that it wasn't just Zoom making me look unflattering. Now that the Botox had fallen out of my face, this was actually how I looked. I wept, more like howled, for several hours straight. If not for the possibility that a Zoom full of strangers was waiting for me, I might still be howling. I thought there'd be hundreds of writers, said DTLA, a new edition, upon entering and seeing only 6 others writing in their own private Idahos. "Me too. I'm going to mute you now," I said, reveling in the small modicum of control afforded a Zoom host in the midst of worldwide chaos. DTLA warily eyed his screen and told us he wasn't sure he would stay, but he wound up writing along with us. I've always resisted the phrase, "something is everything," because there's always a new something, and if all those somethings are everything, then everything is everything. And if everything is everything, then everything is meaningless and everything is nothing. But it turns out I was wrong. Maybe Blanche was onto something. The kindness of strangers is everything. When the only thing standing between me and emotional collapse was one last bar of sea salt dark chocolate, people whose last names, professions, personal aspirations, and political affiliations were unknown to me had rescued this Blanche's sanity. We are all potentially Blanches. We are all strangers capable of kindness. Welcome, stranger. You found us. I type into the chat section every day, and each time I hit end meeting for all, I'm grateful, both for the virtual company and that in a muted Zoom, no one can hear you scream. Thank you.
Oh, Kelley, thank you very much. That was great. Annabelle, come on up. I have a few questions and maybe people in the audience as well.
Am I on? I don't know. I am now. Thank you so much. Oh my gosh, that's so much fun. It's such a pleasure to hear my words written and spoken so beautifully. I realized in that adaptation, I don't think I made it clear because that's the last story in this collection, that Ezra, what is my child who was in college, who actually agreed to sign on to a Zoom with their pronouns they, them, theirs, their mother, which was really a miracle in and of itself. It really took a pandemic for that.
All of you with children know exactly what you're talking about.
Yes, yes.
I have a couple of questions, and I hope people in the audience do as well. My first question is, what about that Zoom writing room? Is it still going, or did it stop?
You know, I did that Zoom room for about 6 months, and it was really the thing that I felt saved me during that really isolated time. And it was because of this idea that it was so intimate, and yet it was more like we were sharing space, but we weren't doing that check-in with friends and family that elicited such emotional responses. It was like a safe place for us. And one thing that was just so funny about the whole thing is that, you know, I never asked people what kind of writers they were. There was no bar for entry. So there was one person who would sign on every day, and she'd maybe write a little, I have no idea what she was really doing on her computer, and then she'd fold laundry. And so some of the other writers would say, like, do you think we should say anything? And I thought, no, you know, it was kind of fantastic. It was kind of like looking at a Degas painting. I was thinking of the laundress. And it was just sort of wonderful. I just thought, I've just created this little space that's intimate, but also safe with strangers. It's sort of like, you know, like I actually thought about being in my old apartment in New York where I had a bank of windows and I could look into someone else's apartment. But it was fascinating, and she just folded laundry for months. How much laundry does one person have? I don't know, it was endless. But it
must have been
fascinating.
her laundry time.
It was, and you know, it was somehow a tonic, and it really did save me. It really did.
That's a wonderful, that is a tiny victory.
As a tiny
Which
victory.
brings me to my next question, which
Yes.
is about Tiny Victory, which is your podcast. Tell me a little bit about that, and what is a tiny victory you've had lately?
Oh, okay. So Tiny Victories was an idea that I had had for a little while, and then it just seemed like a good time to launch it during the pandemic. So we started with this. I host it. It's a tiny podcast. It's 15 minutes long because that's about my attention span that happened during the pandemic. It was very shortened. And so the idea was, because life was so limited at that time, I wanted to do something, a practice for myself. And my co-host is the comedian Laura House. She's also a meditation teacher. She was my meditation teacher. And I thought, I want to make sure I'm cultivating a practice of appreciating small mercies, and minor accomplishments. I mean, really, going from night pajamas to day pajamas at that point seemed like a really big deal. And I thought, this is a great Zen practice in life in general, but in particular, it seemed important at that time. And we've actually continued it now. We're in our second year. And what's the most fun part, I'd rather speak about other people's tiny victories than my own tiny victory, is I did something called, we have the Tiny Victory Hotline. And wherever you get your podcasts, if you want to tune in, people call from all over the world now. And they leave a tiny victory that we play on the show. And it's just so fantastic because, as we say, call in, tell us your tiny victory. A tiny victory is something no one else, you're never going to see a headline about any of these stories. And we got a call the other day from someone who was sitting in traffic and listening to the show in South Africa. And she talked about finding a Dungeons and Dragons group for her kid and how much fun it was and how much happiness she brought to her kid by finding this and how she'd had a really good time being the dungeon master. I have no idea what dungeons, I've never seen any idea, but I just love that, there's never going to be a headline, yay, Yannicka in South Africa sitting in traffic. It's just so wonderful to affirm these tiny moments where you have these little achievements that's what daily living is. And actually that's what interests me as a writer. I write memoir. This is my 5th collection. And I always say I don't think I'm a very interesting person. What I'm interested in life and in the dissonance between things like the way the world sees us, and the way we see the world, and the way we see ourselves, and the selves we are actually living. And in that dissonance, it just comes out as comedy. But these little details of life, and I think it's because I'm such an ordinary person that I can observe these things. That's comedy to me, and that's also what I'm interested in, and that's what Tiny Victories is.
You are as a writer, and my tiny victory, which I will confess, is that I have never listened to podcasts until I started listening to this podcast.
Well, it's short.
Yes.
And that helps.
If you have the attention span of a gnat, which is I do, then it's the podcast for you. My next question is, you are an amazing writer. You have an amazing way of turning dark situations into gold. And I am wondering, and your books are all in this vein, and I'm wondering if there's ever been what the worst dark situation you ever had to write about and turn into gold was.
Well, I'm going to speak about 2 things. One is the centerpiece of this book is, the book takes place at a certain time in my life where I was suddenly finding myself downwardly mobile in midlife, and I didn't know how I was going to hold on to my house, and I decided to become a landlady. And in my mind, I had this idea, I'm going to be like this blousy woman in a house dress, and slippers, and cigarette, and, coffee is served at 7 a.m., just this whole idea. And that didn't exactly happen, but a version of that happened. And when I lost a tenant who was going to move in, I inadvertently signed up for a program, and I ended up being the 7th person in Los Angeles to participate in a program called a host home, where I housed at-risk youth experiencing homelessness in my home. And that story is in this book, along with other stories of other tenants who came and went. And I decided to write about this because what I wanted to write about was my own reckoning with the way I had unintentionally, and I think of myself as a forward-thinking person, a liberal person, I was otherizing other people. I did not understand who was becoming homeless and who was and who these young people were, I was sure they were going to murder me in my sleep. What I didn't know was they were sure I was going to murder them in their sleep. And, you know, when they moved into my home, the first thing they did was call their mothers. They had come to Los Angeles and joined a church. I had no idea who these people were, and I had no idea really who I was, because I didn't understand how I had made up stories about us and them. And for me, that's one of the things that was really dark for me to write about, because I felt like I had to reach a kind of humility, and I wasn't the person that I thought I was, this liberal activist person who was so welcoming the stranger, you know. I had a lot of other ideas of who I was and who they were, and my assumptions about what this meant to be experiencing homelessness. And for me to write about that, I felt very vulnerable and not at all funny, but I think it's the comedy of errors that comes in where the comedy comes from. And if you're following my writing at all right now, I've been chronicling in the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post. I started writing for them a month ago, and I'll be writing a new piece in a few weeks. It's due in a few weeks. How am I going to get it done? Get the writing room going. And that is writing about something that happened to me during COVID. I went in for a COVID test in an urgent care in a mini mall in South Pasadena. I walked in for a COVID test, and I walked out with a diagnosis of stage 4 lung cancer. And I'm in treatment for that now. And this has profoundly changed my life and has challenged my sense of humor and my coping mechanism. But I am writing about this and the unexpected humor that I have found, which really is my nature. I think I have internalized this way of seeing the world. The last piece, if you're interested in reading the last piece I wrote, which is called "The End of My Life Was Killing Me," and that was just published by the Washington Post, and that's these stories about these things that I couldn't have imagined happening, like my fingerprints disappeared through taking this medication. So my first thought was naturally crime. And I tried to steal artwork from Cedars-Sinai's famous collection. I was caught trying to remove a painting from the wall because I thought, what are they going to do, a life sentence? That's not going to be that long. I somehow have become, I think, I didn't intend to set out as a comedy writer, but this is the way that I see the world. And I wanted to I've been obsessed with something all week as I've been sitting at my desk writing this new piece for the Washington Post. I'm going to read this one little quote.
Fine. And then maybe a question or two from the audience, if anybody has one.
So this is what I'm thinking about and what motivates me as a writer, and somehow comes out as comedy. I know that the last thing people think when they read my comedic essays is, how has Annabelle Gurwitch been influenced by Virginia Woolf? And yet, this is something I keep on my desk, and I thought I'd share this. It's from To the Lighthouse. What is the meaning of life? The great revelation had never come. The great revelation perhaps never did come. Instead, there were daily miracles, illuminations, matches struck unexpectedly in the dark. And I love that so much. And it just comes out as comedy in my writing. But that's really what I think about when I'm writing all the time.
That's the core.
That is the core.
Right. Thank you. Does anybody have any questions for Annabelle? Anything from the audience? Come on, you know you do. Excellent.
This is off the wall. I'm from Newcastle, Delaware. What do you remember from Wilmington? Was it good, bad, or indifferent? Wilmington and Newcastle are 5 miles apart.
Oh my gosh. One of my books is really about family. And I write about living in Delaware. My family, I had a kind of itinerant, what makes for a writer, an itinerant childhood. my father was a gambler, and we lived all over the country running from debt. And one of the places we ended up was in my grandmother's home, back in my grandmother's home in Wilmington, Delaware. And I write about that in the book, Wherever You Go, There They Are. Stories about my family you might relate to. And honestly, I feel like the weather is always gray in Delaware. Just like the corporate law that allows corporations to start in Delaware and never pay taxes. There's a lot of gray in Delaware, but it was a haven for us at a time we really needed it. And just wanted to say, I'm so thrilled to be here with Sands Hall. We have something in common. I did not spend a decade in Scientology, but I did spend a decade in a UFO cult. And the story of how I ended up in that cult is in the book, Wherever You Go, There They Are. It looks at families chosen and the families we are born into and the families we choose to find ourselves in. And spoiler alert, the UFOs never came. Hence, I'm still here writing.
Thank you so much, Annabelle. The essay you just heard read is in this book, as well as many, many other equally wonderful ones, and we have another copy of her other book.
And you have I See You Made an Effort,
I See You Made an Effort,
which is it's compliments and dignities and survival stories on the edge of 50. And let me just say, as someone who has turned 60 now, I still stand by that book.
Thank you very much. Annabelle Gurwitch.